Back in the medieval times, hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was non-existent. While we can't go a day without a quick scrub or some hand sanitizer, back then, peasants were lucky if they even got to shower in a week. Can you imagine living like that? Now, throw in a bunch of fleas, lice, and a constant layer of dirt. This was the normal life as a medieval peasant. Now stick around, because the 10 medieval hygiene practices you're about to see in today's video are pretty shocking and gross. Number 1. Infrequent showers. You should be thankful for the constant supply of hot water in your bathrooms, because the peasants in medieval times couldn't even imagine this luxury. Actually, they didn't have any running water at all, and so they went weeks, if not months, without a real good wash. The idea of getting clean wasn't really a priority. They might have rinsed off in a river if they were lucky, but don't get too excited. The bath was usually just a quick dip in murky water, and forget soap. They used things like herbs and ash, which didn't exactly make you smell like a fresh meadow. Brides, for example, sometimes received a bride bouquet, not for looking pretty, but to cover up the odor on their wedding day. Public baths existed, but they were mostly for the rich, and even they didn't have the best hygiene because of how many people used the same water. Number 2. Outhouses and chamber pots. When nature called in medieval times, it was a whole different experience. Peasants had to deal with outhouses, or in some cases, chamber pots. These were small personal toilets they used in their homes, and often tossed the waste out the window into the streets. Yep, you heard that right. If you were lucky, you had a bench with a hole that led straight to a cesspit, which is a fancy term for a giant pit of human waste. The real fun came when the entire village shared one outhouse. Imagine that lovely experience on a hot summer day. And as for toilet paper, they used things like leaves, straws, or rags, and sometimes they didn't even have those. If you were really unlucky, you'd end up wiping with your bare hands. Let's just say the medieval outhouse wasn't exactly the most aromatic place. Number 3. Laundry once a week. While our wardrobes are overflowing with clothes, owning even 2 sets of clothes was uncommon in the medieval times. Most peasants had just a single set of clothing. No clothes meant no laundry. Gosh, that's one less chore to do. Really? Well, this also meant that most of them were stinking in dirt and sweat. Washing clothes happened about once a week, if they were lucky. And when the outfits needed washing, they didn't have modern detergents. Instead, they used lye soap and scrubbed their clothes in rivers. The problem was, those rivers were already polluted with everything you can imagine. Human waste, animal waste, dead animals, you name it. So while peasants tried to clean their clothes, they were just swirling their garments in filth. Ever wondered why medieval people had that distinct smell? Now you know. Fresh clothes weren't really a thing, and that's why people lived with a perpetual, earthy scent that could knock you out. Number 4. Delousing. Lice were the medieval equivalent of an unwanted pet, except you couldn't just shoo them away. They were constant companions to peasants who lived in cramped, dark, and damp homes. To battle the little monsters, peasants had to get creative. One of the more common methods was using fine-tooth combs to literally pick the lice out of their hair. Think of it as a really gross version of a spa treatment, where instead of relaxation, you were constantly battling tiny bloodsuckers. The combs weren't exactly delicate either, often made from bone or metal, and you'd have to go through your hair for hours to get every last little louse. Imagine trying to pull lice out of your scalp while itching like crazy. For those who could afford it, herbal concoctions and oils might help, but for most peasants, it was just a daily fight against the ever-present lice. Number 5. Bed made of straw. Ah, those soft and comfortable beds that we never want to leave. But what did the peasants back in the medieval times sleep on? Well, if you were a peasant, your bed was likely a heap of straw on the ground, maybe covered with an old scratchy blanket if you were lucky. It was like sleeping in a pile of hay. Straw wasn't just uncomfortable though, it was a perfect breeding ground for bugs, fleas, and other creepy crawlies. If that wasn't bad enough, peasants didn't have regular access to clean bedding. So you can imagine how quickly the straw would become damp, stinky, and even moldy in a damp, poorly ventilated house. Changing of the bed straw depended on the availability and the need to stay clean, which we know nobody really cared about. Plus, the homes were tiny to keep in the warmth, and so privacy wasn't there. You might be sharing your straw bed with your family, animals, and possibly a few rats. Something even more shocking is how the medieval women dealt with feminine hygiene, and I'll tell you about that in a few moments. But before that, smash that subscribe button like it's a medieval castle gate. There you go. Thank you. Now back to the video. Number 6. Feminine hygiene. When it came to feminine hygiene, medieval peasants didn't exactly have the luxury of pads or tampons. Instead, women had to make do with whatever they could manage. Most often, it meant using old rags, moss, or even twigs. These materials were far from sanitary, but they were the best options in a world without proper hygiene products. The shame surrounding menstruation was real too. Religious authorities would often make women feel dirty and sinful, creating a cultural taboo around menstruation that made it something to hide at all costs. Women were often taught to disguise it, sometimes by wearing extra layers or by using herbs to mask the smell. In some cases, they were even instructed to isolate themselves during their period to avoid contaminating others. So naturally, many women suffered infections and even died tragically young, around 30 to 40 years of age. Number 7. Toothbrushes made of twigs from hazel trees. Now let's talk about the dental hygiene. What? Well, it was nowhere near satisfactory. If you were a peasant, you didn't have fancy toothbrushes or toothpaste. Instead, you used twigs from hazel trees. Yup, you'd chew on one end to soften it, then use it like a brush to scrub your teeth. The idea of scrubbing away plaque was not really on their radar. Instead, peasants often rubbed their teeth with a mixture of salt and sage. It wasn't the most effective, but hey, it was better than doing nothing. And if you wanted to go extra medieval, you could even use wool to clean your teeth. Forget flossing too. Unlike us today, peasants ate very little sugar, mostly due to their light budgets, so cavities weren't much of a problem. Plus, there were no fancy dentists around to fill cavities or straighten teeth. So, if you had bad teeth, well, tough luck. Just hope you didn't need a tooth pulled because there was no numbing process, and the dentist would simply pull the tooth out for good measure. Brutal, I know. Number 8. Lack of hygiene knowledge. One might stop and think, why did these people keep dirty in the first place? Well, when it came to hygiene, medieval peasants were basically flying blind. They didn't have the understanding we have today about germs, bacteria, or the importance of hand washing. There was no concept of cleanliness is next to godliness. In fact, in some places, the idea of too much cleanliness was even frowned upon. Bathing wasn't seen as something you did often, more like a once-in-a-blue-moon kind of deal. Those poor people just didn't know that bathing regularly would help prevent disease, so many peasants went weeks or even months without ever getting a good scrub. Add in the fact that medieval folk didn't understand how infections spread, and you've got a recipe for disaster. People would stick their hands into communal food bowls, and they didn't know that sharing lice-infested combs wasn't exactly healthy. The doctors didn't know any better, and the treatments were mostly useless. Number 9. Use of perfumes and fragrances. To keep the stench and smells away, people turned to perfumes and fragrances. However, for peasants, access to these sweet-smelling remedies was limited. They often relied on natural, readily available resources to mask unpleasant odors. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme were commonly used to scent clothing and living spaces. Clothes, indoor spaces, and washing water were scented with herbal oils. This practice not only provided a more pleasant aroma, but also help deter pests. For personal fragrance, peasants might carry small bags of fragrant herbs or flowers, known as sachets, to ward off bad smells. These sachets were the medieval equivalent of today's air fresheners, offering a modest relief for your nose from the less than pleasant scents of daily life. The richer classes had access to more elaborate perfumes, often imported and made from exotic ingredients like ambergris, musk, and various essential oils. They stored these scents in ornate containers called pomanders, which were worn or carried to provide a continuous source of fragrance. Number 10. Use of fire to sterilize and disinfect. One of the most important cleaning practices in the medieval times was the use of fire. The fire was used to heat homes and buildings as well as to cook food. But the concept of sterilization was as foreign as a toothbrush. People had a vague idea that fire could purify, but their methods were more about chasing away evil spirits than killing germs. They'd burn aromatic woods, thinking the smoke would cleanse the air of malevolent forces. Little did they know, while they were busy exorcising demons, they were also giving bacteria a free pass. When it came to medical instruments, the situation was equally grim. The idea of using fire to sterilize tools didn't gain traction until much later. In fact, it wasn't until the 19th century that boiling instruments became a common practice. Before that, a quick rinse in water, clean or not, was considered sufficient. So, while medieval folks might have thought they were purifying their surroundings with fire and smoke, their lack of understanding about germs meant they were often just adding a smoky flavor to their already questionable hygiene practices. It's a wonder anyone survived at all. So are you feeling thankful for all the hygiene products we have today to keep us safe? I know I am. Now check out this video on the screen, and I'll see you there.